165 AD. Rome is at its height. The empire stretches from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. 5 million square kilometers, 60 million people. The most sophisticated political and economic system the Western world has ever produced. And it is about to be hit by something that no army, no senate, no philosophical school, and no amount of wealth has ever learned to fight. A plague, not a metaphor, not a political crisis dressed up as a disease. A genuine, catastrophic, empire-wide pandemic arriving from the Eastern campaigns, spreading along every trade route that connected Rome to the known world and killing somewhere between 5 and 10 million people over the course of 15 years. At the height of the dying, 2,000 people a day were dying in Rome alone. And in the imperial palace, a man who had never wanted to be emperor, who had spent his entire adult life reading philosophy and writing private journals and trying to be better than the position forced him to be, sat down every night and wrote. Not decrees, not eulogies, not the kind of thing emperors write when they know history is watching. He wrote to himself, honestly, about fear and loss, and the question of how a person is supposed to hold a crumbling world together when the philosophy he has spent a lifetime studying is being tested in ways no philosophy was ever designed for. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and this, the Plague Years, is the chapter of his story that most people never hear. It is also, I believe, the most important financial story in ancient history, not because it is about money, but it is about what survives when money cannot protect you, what endures when the market, the entire market, the economic infrastructure of civilization, begins to fail, what a person of genuine wisdom does when the external world offers nothing reliable to stand on. Take your time with this one. Make a cup of something warm. We are going to be here a while, and I promise, by the end, you will see your own financial life differently. To understand what the plague destroyed, you first need to understand what it found. The Roman Empire of the mid-2nd century AD was the most economically sophisticated system in the ancient world. Trade routes connected every corner of the known world to Rome: silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, slaves and soldiers from the Germanic frontier. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake, and the lake was busy. Rome's financial system, by modern standards, was primitive. There were no stock markets, no central banks, no compound interest in the sense we understand it. But there were banks, the argentarii, that accepted deposits, made loans, and facilitated trade across vast distances. There were property ownership, inheritance law, commercial contracts, and insurance against maritime loss. There was, in the language of ancient Rome, negotium, the business of the world. And it worked. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had delivered nearly 2 centuries of relative stability in which wealth could accumulate, be passed down, be reinvested, and be grown. The merchant class was prosperous. The landowning aristocracy was powerful. Even the middle orders, the shopkeepers, the skilled craftsmen, the minor administrators, had genuine economic security. This was the world Marcus Aurelius inherited when Antoninus Pius died in 161 AD. Marcus had been trained for the role since childhood. Adopted by Antoninus at the instruction of the Emperor Hadrian, he had spent 23 years as a kind of senior apprentice, watching, learning, being prepared. He was, by every account, a man of extraordinary seriousness and genuine goodness. His tutors described him as almost impossible to provoke. His contemporaries described him as unnervingly honest. But power did not interest him. Philosophy did. And there is a very specific kind of private tragedy in a person of genuine intellectual depth being handed the most demanding executive role in the known world and accepting it anyway, because the philosophy he had spent his life studying told him that duty was non-negotiable. From the beginning of his reign, Marcus kept writing in his journals. We know this because the journals survived. And what you find in those early years, before the plague, before the wars, before the accumulated weight of crisis, is a man already preparing himself for loss, already practicing, philosophically, the art of holding things lightly. He wrote that line, and hundreds like it, not as a finished philosopher delivering conclusions, but as a person in active struggle, trying daily to close the gap between what he knew and how he lived. The Meditations read less like a philosophical treatise and more like a man talking himself through a life he finds genuinely difficult. That authenticity, the rawness of it, is why the book has survived 2,000 years, and it is why the plague years, when that struggle became existential, produced some of the most extraordinary financial wisdom ever written, even though Marcus never intended it as financial wisdom at all. To understand what the plague disrupted, it helps to understand what wealth meant in Marcus's Rome. Wealth was, above all, land. The great senatorial families owned agricultural estates across Italy and the provinces, worked by slaves and tenant farmers, producing grain, wine, olive oil, and wool for a market that stretched across the empire. Land was stable, income-generating, and could be passed between generations without the volatility that plagued liquid assets. The lowland came urban property, the insulae, the apartment buildings of Rome and the other great cities, which generated rental income from the enormous urban population that the empire's trade had created. Then came commercial interests, partnerships in trading ventures, loans at interest, contracts with the state for tax collection or military supply. Then came cash and precious metals, stored against future need. The wealthy Roman's portfolio, in modern terms, was heavily weighted toward real assets, property, agricultural land, and productive capacity, with a smaller allocation to liquid holdings and commercial ventures. It was, by design, a long-term portfolio, built to survive generations, not to capitalize on individual opportunities. And then the soldiers came home from the east, and they brought something with them that no portfolio design had ever accounted for. The plague arrived in Rome in 165 AD, carried by soldiers returning from the campaigns of Lucius Verus in the east. It had already swept through the legions stationed in the Parthian territories. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote of soldiers dying in their thousands before anyone understood what they were facing. Modern historians believe the Antonine Plague was almost certainly smallpox, a disease to which the Mediterranean world had no previous exposure and therefore no immunity. It spread with devastating efficiency along the trade routes that were Rome's economic lifeline, the same roads and sea lanes that carried silk and spices and grain now carried something invisible and lethal. The mortality rate is estimated at between 7 and 10% of the total population over the course of the outbreak. In a city the size of Rome, perhaps 1 million people at its peak, 2,000 deaths per day at the height of the epidemic. In the provinces, the numbers were proportionally similar or worse, 5 to 10 million people dead across the empire over 15 years. The physician Galen, one of the greatest medical minds of antiquity and a contemporary of Marcus, described the symptoms in clinical detail: fever, diarrhea, inflammation of the throat, and a pustular rash that appeared on the 9th day. He watched patients die, and documented what he saw with the systematic precision of a man who understood that documentation was the only useful thing medicine could offer when treatment was impossible. He also fled Rome during the worst of it, even Galen. The financial consequences of the plague were as devastating as the human ones, and they played out in ways that any modern investor would recognize with uncomfortable clarity. First, labor collapsed. The agricultural estates that formed the foundation of Roman wealth required workers. The plague killed them in enormous numbers, including enslaved people, tenant farmers, and free agricultural laborers. Fields went unplanted, harvests failed. Food prices rose across the empire as supply fell, and the trade routes that normally compensated for regional shortfalls were themselves disrupted by the same death rates. Second, trade contracted. The merchants who moved goods between the provinces, the people who made the interconnected Roman economy function, died or retreated. Port cities that lived on trade went quiet. Commercial partnerships that had operated for generations dissolved when the partners died or the goods stopped moving. The sophisticated web of credit and contract that underpinned Roman commerce began to unravel. Third, tax revenue collapsed. The Roman state funded its armies, its infrastructure, and its social programs through taxation. When the population died, the tax base died with it. Marcus faced a government financial crisis of a kind his predecessors had never encountered, not because of profligacy or mismanagement, but because the human beings who generated the empire's revenue were dying faster than anyone could count. Fourth, and most devastatingly for long-term wealth, the confidence that underpinned economic activity evaporated. People stopped making long-term investments when they did not know if they would be alive to see the returns. Commercial ventures that required years to generate profit were abandoned. The time horizon of the entire economy contracted, from the generational thinking that built Roman wealth to the desperate short-termism of a population trying to survive the present month. That line, written during the plague years, reads differently when you understand the context. Marcus was not writing a philosophical abstraction about mindfulness. He was writing a survival instruction for an emperor watching his empire's economic foundations crack. What Marcus did in response to the economic catastrophe of the plague is one of the most instructive case studies in crisis financial management in all ancient history, and almost no one outside academic circles knows about it. When the treasury was depleted, when the normal mechanisms of Roman state finance could not cover the cost of the wars and the plague simultaneously, Marcus did something extraordinary. He called an auction. In the Forum of Trajan, he sold the imperial family's personal treasures: gold cups, crystal vessels, silk robes, paintings, statues, the accumulated luxury of generations of imperial collecting. He did not raise taxes. He sold his own possessions. The historian Cassius Dio records that the auction ran for 2 months, and Marcus used the proceeds to fund not the war, not the military campaign that consumed so much of his attention, but the social infrastructure that kept the civilian population alive. Food distribution, medical support, the burial of the dead, which had become a public health crisis when families could no longer afford private burial. He also, quietly and without announcement, began a series of legal and administrative reforms designed to rebuild the economic base of the empire after the plague. He made it easier for freed slaves to own property. He reformed inheritance law to allow wealth to pass more efficiently between generations. He reduced certain taxes in the provinces most devastated by disease, understanding that an overtaxed population recovering from catastrophe cannot rebuild. None of these decisions was philosophical. They were practical, precise, and in several cases politically costly. The senatorial class that benefited from the existing tax arrangements was not pleased. But they reflected something that Marcus understood at a level most administrators never reach, that the long-term restoration of economic capacity is always more valuable than the short-term extraction of revenue from a damaged system. He was writing that to himself, about his own fear, about the weight of ruling an empire through a catastrophe that his philosophy had not specifically prepared him for. But embedded in it is a financial principle that every investor who has ever faced a market crisis needs to hear. The weapons of reason that work today are the same ones that will work tomorrow. Not new strategies, not panic-driven pivots, not the abandonment of long-term thinking because the short-term is terrifying. The same weapons, applied with the same patience, even when, especially when, the present moment is at its most frightening. Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina had at least 14 children. The exact number is disputed, ancient sources disagree, and the plague makes the records unreliable. What is certain is that most of them died young. Several, almost certainly during the plague years themselves. We know Marcus grieved. There are references in ancient sources to him being seen publicly distressed after the deaths of children. He broke the Stoic rule about not showing grief, or perhaps showed that Stoicism was never about suppressing grief, but about refusing to be overwhelmed by it. He also lost Lucius Verus, his co-emperor, his adoptive brother, the person with whom he had shared the enormous burden of ruling an empire at war, to the plague in 169 AD. Marcus was left alone at the top of an empire that was simultaneously fighting a devastating war on its northern frontier and managing the ongoing catastrophe of the disease. And he kept writing. The Meditations, the private journal that no one was ever meant to read, becomes, in the plague years, something almost unbearable in its honesty. You can feel the weight of what he was carrying, the exhaustion beneath the philosophical discipline, the genuine struggle to apply, in real conditions, the principles he had spent decades studying in relatively comfortable circumstances. He wrote that during a period when he was losing children, losing advisors, losing soldiers, losing the economic stability of the empire he was responsible for. That line is not the serene reflection of a philosopher at peace. It is the desperate, daily discipline of a man trying to hold himself together by reminding himself of what he believes. That distinction matters enormously for how we understand patience as a financial strategy. In financial contexts, the word patience often refers to a kind of comfortable waiting, holding your investments through a rough quarter, not checking your portfolio every day, being sensible about time horizons. That is not what Marcus was practicing during the plague years. What Marcus practiced, what the Meditations reveal with devastating clarity, was active, effortful, daily patience. The kind that requires genuine discipline, because every instinct, every fear, every piece of incoming information is telling you to do something different, to react, to change course, to make the short-term decision that offers immediate relief, even at a long-term cost. He sold the imperial treasures rather than raising taxes because short-term political expedients would have harmed the long-term economic recovery. He maintained the administrative reforms through enormous opposition because the short-term cost of political resistance was less than the long-term cost of an unreformed system. He kept fighting the wars on the northern frontier because the short-term appeal of withdrawal would have created vulnerabilities that would cost far more later. Every one of those decisions required him to absorb short-term pain in service of a long-term outcome he could not guarantee he would live to see. That is the financial definition of patience, not comfortable waiting. The willingness to absorb real, present, painful loss in service of an outcome that exists only in the future, and to do so consistently, over years, while everything around you argues for a different response. Confine yourself to the present, not as an instruction to ignore the future, but as a reminder that the only decisions available to you exist in the now. The market crash happening today does not require you to solve it permanently today. It requires you to make the right decision today, and then again tomorrow, and then again the day after. Compounded over years, those daily right decisions, each one made in the present, each one consistent with the long-term framework, produce the same result as compound interest, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly, the gap between where you are and where you were is enormous. By the mid-170s AD, the worst of the Antonine Plague had passed. The empire had not collapsed, though it had come close. The economic damage was real and lasting. The population had not recovered. The labor shortage persisted for decades. The confidence that underpinned long-term commercial investment took a generation to rebuild. And the people who had maintained their financial positions through the plague years, who had not sold their land in panic, who had not abandoned their commercial relationships, who had not converted long-term holdings into short-term cash at the worst possible moment, emerged from the recovery in a fundamentally stronger position than those who had. Not because they were wealthier in absolute terms. Many of them were not, but because they had preserved the structures, the land, the relationships, the productive capacity, the recovery needed to build on. They had kept their long-term foundations intact through a period when every short-term signal was telling them to abandon those foundations. That is the origin story of wealth after catastrophe. It is not the story of the person who predicted the crisis and moved to cash. It is almost always the story of the person who maintained the structure through the crisis and was positioned to benefit when the world began, slowly, to normalize. The plague destroyed an enormous amount. It killed millions of people. It disrupted the economic foundations of the most sophisticated civilization in the Western world. It shortened the life expectancy of an entire generation and contracted the population for decades. But some things survived, not because they were financially structured against the plague. No financial structure anticipates an empire-wide pandemic, but because they were built on foundations that external catastrophe cannot reach. The land survived, diminished in productive capacity, worked by fewer people, generating lower yields, but still there, still producing, still capable of recovery when the conditions improved. The productive real assets that formed the foundation of Roman wealth proved more durable than the commercial structures built on top of them. The relationships survived. The commercial partnerships, the familial bonds, and the networks of trust that underpinned Roman economic life were damaged but not destroyed. The people who had maintained those relationships through the plague, who had honored their commitments when it was easier to walk away, who had supported their partners when support was costly, emerged from the plague years with the social capital that the recovery required. And the philosophy survived. Specifically, Marcus's private journals survived. 2,000 years of political upheaval, barbarian invasions, the fall of the Western Empire, the medieval period, the Renaissance, and the modern era. A private notebook, never intended for publication, written by a man trying to hold himself together during a catastrophe, survived all of it, because it was built on something that external events cannot reach. Not a system, not a strategy, a way of seeing, a habit of mind, a daily practice of examining what is in your control, accepting what is not, and responding with reason rather than reaction. That line, possibly the most quoted line from the Meditations, was not written in philosophical serenity. It was written during the plague years, by a man who had watched the obstacles multiply until they seemed to be the only thing left. After 30 years of studying this period and sitting with Marcus's words, 3 financial truths emerge from the plague years with the clarity of things that have been tested at the highest possible temperature and survived. The first truth: real assets endure when paper confidence does not. In every economic crisis in history, from the Antonine Plague to the Great Depression to 2008, the productive assets that generate real value have proven more durable than the financial instruments built on top of them. Land, productive capacity, genuine skills, and real relationships, these are the things that remain when the system built around them is temporarily disrupted. Build your wealth on real foundations, always. The second truth: the framework you build before the crisis is the only thing that protects you during it. Marcus's philosophical practice, developed across decades of relative stability, was the only tool that allowed him to make rational decisions during the plague years. He did not develop a crisis philosophy during the crisis. He applied the philosophy he already had. The investor who has a written investment policy, a clear long-term framework, and a genuine understanding of what they believe about money before the market crashes, that investor makes different decisions during the crash than one who has only ever thought about money during the good years. The third truth: recovery always comes, not quickly, not without loss, not in the form you expected or on the timeline you hoped for, but the economic history of every civilization that has survived a catastrophe is, ultimately, the history of recovery. Marcus's empire recovered from the Antonine Plague. The labor shortage was eventually addressed. The trade routes reopened. The agricultural production has been restored. The wealth was rebuilt, not to the same shape, but rebuilt. The person who maintained their position through the crisis was positioned for the recovery. The person who liquidated in panic was locked in the loss permanently. Marcus Aurelius died in a military tent near the Danube in 180 AD. He was 58 years old. He had ruled Rome for 19 years through a plague, 2 major wars, and a series of personal losses that would have broken most people. He also left behind a notebook, 12 books of private reflections, written across the most difficult years of his life, were never intended for anyone else to read. And in that notebook, in the honesty of a man talking to himself, trying to be better, trying to hold himself together, trying to apply what he had learned to a reality that had not been kind, is the most complete financial philosophy I have ever encountered. Not because it is about finance, but because it is about the things that finance, ultimately, is always about: time, loss, recovery, what endures, what matters, how to respond when the world offers nothing reliable to stand on. The plague years taught Marcus, and they teach us, if we are willing to sit with them, that wealth is not a number. It is a posture, a set of foundations, a framework of thinking built in calm, applied in crisis, maintained through loss, and offered quietly to the recovery when it comes. That is what did not burn. That is what this channel is for. If you watched this entire episode, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of content I made this channel to make. And the fact that you are still here means something. Subscribe to Disciplined Wealth. Leave a comment below. Tell me which of the 3 financial truths landed hardest for you. I will see you in the next episode.